Thank you, Rachel, and thank you to those of you who have joined us today. And we hope as we continue along that more of your colleagues will also continue to join as we go in. And so really welcome to those of you who are on the call. This is an interesting discussion that we're going to have. And as you see, we have a very technical title to this session. Is MOD really a thing? I worked long and hard on that. You can tell that I have an engineering background when I say something like this. But no, we're really excited to have this discussion. And we're really excited to have our partners in this effort. Jacob Nelson with AAA and Jake, and then Andy Taylor with Cubic, as we have been really spending the last year in the start of an effort where we really want to think about what does the public truly think about mobility on demand? What are the use? What are their perceptions? And how are they seeing this world, which we are very easily seeped in? And I think as we sit and we think about our world of how we look at transportation and transportation policy and planning and interactions and partnerships, it is easy for us to go like this in our blinders in our world. And it's more importantly also to make sure that we understand those customer interactions and where the customers are in this space and how they see this space. And so with that, as we were moving through this, we have launched what we hope to be actually a biannual survey that really assesses the state of mobility on demand in the nation. And following in the footsteps actually of some partnerships that AAA often does, where they assess what does the public really think about self-driving and automated vehicles, we wanted to do the same with MOD. And so there, in partnering with AAA, we have been really pleased to be able to complete this study and are planning to, again, as I mentioned, to bring it out. And so with that, I wanted to kick this off today by having Jake take us through the results, to take us through what the public says about these services. And, a few caveats as we do this, recognizing that we were working on this in the year 2020. And the 2020 year was slightly impacted by a few things from a transportation perspective. We did take that obviously into account as we were moving through the survey and the like. But the reason that we have these details and the reason when we wanted to continue to move ahead is to baseline this world, to create a baseline, to validate it against other work out there that you're seeing, to be able to pull together all of the different surveys, whether we're talking about on-demand mobility as it relates to vehicles and to ride sourcing, whether we're talking about things like scooters and micromobility, whether we're talking about things like on-demand transit, whether it be microtransit or other services, and to be able to group these into an umbrella class that really starts to define when you put mobility at people's fingertips, what does it mean and how do they use it? So that's what we're going to get into today. Jake is going to take us through, and then we're really pleased to have Cubic join us as a sponsor also on this study. And, Andy and the work that he has been doing around the world, frankly, helps provide insight into the matching, if you will, of these community and public perceptions and usage with how the users and how the planners and how our partnerships are really fusing together those experiences to take it to that next level. So with that, and I think that you guys know that we often do this, I'm going to be asking you some questions in our audience. So remember that question at the very beginning, is MOD really a thing? We're going to have Jake go through some of his chat first, and then I'm going to be asking you guys that, and I'd love to talk with you as you're seeing some of these results, what it means to be a thing, and how we keep it moving forward. So Jake, why don't you kick us off?
All right, thanks, Amy. And I'm going to lose the glasses just so that you can tell Andy and I apart. Sound good? All right. So Amy, you covered most of what's on this slide. I would just point out that, one of the things that we wanted to do at AAA is understand how to talk about this issue. Mobility on demand is a term that we use inside industry, but your neighbor, the mailman, the guy who works at the gas station, you could ask him or her about mobility on demand, and they probably wouldn't know what we were talking about. So we want to know how to talk about it, how to have meaningful conversations and educate folks about these programs and services. And that actually was kind of a challenge for us when we were designing the survey instrument, is how do you ask people about something they may not have heard before? And so you'll see some of that sort of come through in the data slides that I share. One of the things that we're planning to use the results of this survey to do is to make sure that the end user, our members at AAA, everyday people out throughout the United States, that their needs and preferences are reflected in the way that these programs are implemented, expanded, that kind of thing, as we march forward. So there were four major objectives of this study. First, we want to understand who are users and non-users of these services. Looked at a variety of demographic variables to see whether or not we could predict what makes for a mod user versus a non-user. Then we took a look at, among people who had experience in using mobility on demand, what did they think about it? What were their attitudes and beliefs about these services? On objective C, this is where we were surveying not just people who had exposure to mobility on demand, but everyone, just the general population, all the respondents of our survey. And we painted for them two versions of the world. And I'll describe that in more detail as we get closer to those data slides. But we provided two different scenarios of what this could look like, and then asked a variety of questions in response to that scenario. And then lastly, we wanted to understand challenges, real or perceived, about using mobility on demand services in the communities where people live. So let's jump right in. So first up, we're trying to understand who are users and non-users of mobility on demand. And I think the big takeaway here is that driver status, urbanicity, and age are the most predictive variables for whether or not somebody had experience in using mobility on demand. And here is one of our data slides to dive into that a little bit more closely. So these are the results of some multivariate analysis, just some modeling where we can look at the relative impact or contribution of different demographic variables as predictors of whether or not somebody is a mobility on demand user. And I think in looking at this bar chart, what you should take away is the bigger the bar, the more predictive or more of an influence that particular demographic variable allowed us to predict mod exposure or experience. And so you see being a non-driver, not owning your own personal automobile, is a predictor of mod exposure. And then urbanicity, living in an urban center, means that you are more likely to have exposure to mobility on demand. No big surprise there. And then your age matters as well. So younger groups tend to have had more experience and exposure to mobility on demand. All right, on this slide, we're looking at what proportion of the population has had exposure to mobility on demand, so that they use it. They've used it regularly or often, and that's about 4 out of 10 people, but 6 out of 10 have never used any form of mobility on demand mode, or they've used it only once. And so if we break these data out a little bit more, looking at urbanicity or community type, again, no surprise, you see that the proportion of people who have exposure or experience in using mobility on demand is greatest among urban centers, and then shrinks as you move from suburban to rural. I think one thing worth pointing out here is even though the penetration or the proportion of people who have exposure or experience to using mobility on demand is greatest in urban communities as compared to suburban, if you were to look at just the raw number of people who responded to our survey in each of these categories, they're roughly the same. And so this just has to do with urban sprawl and where these programs are concentrated. So now we're moving into objective B, and this is where we're asking questions only of people who have experience or exposure to in their past to mobility on demand modes of transportation. And we're asking them about their attitudes and beliefs based on their experience. And I think the big takeaways here for us are that ride hailing is king, and that also people have a hard time in terms of thinking about how this will evolve and expand into the future. Folks have a hard time of envisioning a version of the future that looks different from the reality that they know. And so we'll dive into that a little bit more detail momentarily. And so here what you're looking at, again, we're asking only people who said that they had experience or exposure to using mobility on demand modes. And we're asking them about which modes they used in the past 6 months. And so you can see here that regardless of the kind of community or the urbanicity of the community where somebody lives, that ride hailing services like Uber and Lyft dominate as compared to the other modes that we included in our survey. So Amy mentioned that there may have been a global pandemic that happened while we were planning and executing our survey. And so we wanted to make sure that to the extent that we could reasonably quantify the potential impact on the responses that people gave to our survey based on the fact that there was a pandemic going on. And as you can see here, for all mod users, that about 66% of people reported that they used mobility on demand modes of transportation less often than they did before the pandemic. Smaller proportion in rural communities, but that shouldn't really surprise us because there are fewer mobility on demand modes of transportation available in rural communities. So this is an interesting slide. And what we're looking at here are the results of survey questions that ask people, based on the trip that they took and the mode that they used. Had that mode not been available when they went to take that trip, how would they have completed that trip? And I think if you can see past the rows and columns here, one of the themes that pops out is that trips that were taken using automobiles, for example, were replaced by other automobile trips. And so if it wasn't taking your own car, it was getting a ride from a friend or family member, or using Uber and Lyft. And so vehicle traffic replacing vehicle traffic. And on the right-hand side of this table, you see that active transportation trips were replaced by other active transportation trips. And so if a rented scooter or rented bicycle wasn't available at the time that somebody took a particular trip, they indicated that they primarily would walk to their destination. The one exception might be in the lowest rightmost corner there, that they would not have gone. The row right above it, 31%, that folks who took a bicycle to complete a particular trip, about a third of them indicated that that they would have taken their own bike if a rented bike wasn't available. And so the sample size here is pretty small, but an interesting artifact in the data nonetheless. So on this slide, what we're looking at is the willingness of respondents to our survey to give up their personal automobile in the next 2 years if mobility on demand programs and services were to be available at that time. And looking at all adults, most people, 67%, very unlikely or unlikely to give up their personal automobile. We see that folks who live in urban communities are a little bit more willing to do so, very likely or likely, but that's not a surprise given all of our experience in cities like Chicago, New York, San Francisco, that kind of a thing. These programs are more popular and available in these kinds of communities. And so I think there are just fewer people who own their own automobile or would be more willing to give it up in exchange for these kinds of modes of transportation. All right, so now we're gonna dive in a little bit deeper to looking at the future use of mod. And this is also sort of the collection of questions where we presented some scenarios, which I'll explain in more detail momentarily, and ask people to respond to those different scenarios. And so on this slide, we're asking about satisfaction. So again, these are people who are users of mobility on demand. They have experience in using them. They use them regularly or frequently. And I think the key takeaway here is that if you have exposure to one or more of these modes of transportation, you're a regular user of them, you're satisfied with them. And when we look at these results by generation or age group, it remains constant. So if you have experience in using mobility on demand, you tend to be really happy with what your experience was. And this is especially true for baby boomers, at least especially as compared to millennials. So here we're looking at results of a question where we asked users of mobility on demand how they thought these kinds of programs impacted their community where they lived. And so by and large, regardless of urbanicity of the community where you live or across age group or generation, a majority of respondents to our survey indicated that mobility on demand made their community better off than it would be without it. And then among those who indicated that it would make their community worse off, there were so few respondents who indicated that response that the sample sizes were too low to even dig into them in more detail. So generally speaking, you use it, you have a very positive experience with mobility on demand. You're satisfied with the options that you've got available to you, and you believe that these programs and services make your community better off than it would be without them. And so I expect no one to read this slide. This is really more of reference material after our webinar today. But I had mentioned that there were two scenarios that we presented to respondents to our survey. One we called micromobility, and this is where we described things like rented scooters and bikes, ride sharing, those kinds of things that you could access in real time to get to where you need to go using kiosks in the community or an app on your smartphone, or that you could pay for using a mass transit card, regardless of the mode that you used. And then the North Star scenario is essentially the best, most ideal version of a mobility on demand program that we could think up, that it met all of your needs. You could get to where you needed to go, regardless of the trip purpose, that you could get there when you needed to get there, that it was easy to access all of these different modes, connect them together through an app on your phone, and pay them with more of a subscription service. So when we looked at the variety of demographic variables that we collected in this survey exercise to see how we could predict likelihood to use either of these two scenarios, being an urban adult or living in an urban center community was the most significant predictor. And that's true for both the micromobility scenario and also the North Star or ideal mobility on demand scenario. And so if we were to dig deeper into just urban dwellers to see what other predictors that we could identify, for the North Star scenario, having a higher level of education or being essentially among a higher socioeconomic status group was also a predictor of willingness to use the North Star scenario in particular. And that really is not too much of a surprise, because in the North Star scenario, you essentially have to have access to a smartphone and a credit card, which by default puts you in a higher socioeconomic status group. So in the last objective of our study, we're looking to understand better potential concerns that people might have regarding use of mobility on demand. And this is important so that we can address those or correct for them to help facilitate greater use of these programs and services. And let me just go back here for 1 second. The paragraph at the bottom, because we had just presented to respondents in the survey the micromobility and the North Star scenarios, it was really important before we got into the next few questions to sort of reset the frame against which respondents were providing responses to survey questions. And so this little narrative down here is sort of the version of the world that we painted for the survey respondents before asking them the next few questions. So let's dive in. So when we ask about potential concerns about mobility on demand among the general population, so this is regardless of whether somebody has had previous experience in using it or not. And the first bar that you see there is actually a net outcome. And so that includes at 71%, and it basically is to help indicate that, concerns over safety essentially top the list. But what that 71% represents is the three bars marked with an asterisk on the left-hand most side where they are described. And so safety of using non-vehicle transportation options alongside vehicle traffic, trust of hired drivers that may not have been properly vetted, for example, background checks for rideshare drivers, and then also safety of operating a non-vehicle transportation device as somebody who has limited personal mobility. I don't know about your grandfather and grandmother, but I can't really picture my grandfather and grandmother riding a scooter or a bicycle, especially if they have to carry anything in their hands. And so that's really what that safety concern is getting at. So if you condense all of those together, it provides sort of the net safety outcome of 71% there. And if we ask that same question and sort of stratify it looking at, urbanicity, So whether you live in an urban, suburban, or rural community, it's the same exact trend, and safety still tops the list, whether you sort of provide that net safety result or you look at them independently. The three there are marked with the asterisks again. And just a note here is that the safety concern about trust of hired drivers having not been properly vetted, that there was a statistically significant difference among genders. And so women in particular responded 53% of the time that was a concern for them as compared to 44% of men. And so there was a difference there based on gender. So just in terms of some key takeaways, implications, and outcomes here, as we look at the results of the survey, there are many more. There's much more data than we shared with you all today, and we're continuing to dig into that to see what else we can learn from this exercise. But based on what I've shared with you all this afternoon, we know that from an emissions or climate change point of view, that mobility on demand isn't, at least in the near term, likely to address those concerns, because again, vehicle-based trips are replacing other vehicle-based trips, and active transportation trips are replacing other active transportation trips. So there's not really the modal shift that I think we've all probably heard about within this community. The potential barriers, so the safety concerns, and I think Amy, you mentioned the AV survey that AAA has done separate from this exercise, and I think that we learned the same thing from asking people about what might be some barriers or concerns about using a fully automated vehicle, and safety topped the list there as well. And so all this really means for us is that this is an opportunity, right? Whether these safety concerns are real or just perceived safety concerns, to the end user, they are real. And it's important, I think, for us as stakeholders on this issue to work actively to address them and to educate consumers about the reality of the situation, or to work through policy and other means to address these safety concerns so that we can alleviate them if we want more people to take advantage of mobility on demand. In terms of mobility on demand being a disruptor to traditional automobile ownership and use, at least as it relates to the results collected in this survey exercise, that doesn't seem to be the case. People are generally unwilling to give up their ownership of their personal automobile in exchange for mobility on demand. But anything can change in the future, and that's one of the benefits of doing this survey multiple times over time to track differences in that sentiment. The next bullet here talks about intent to use today and the future. This is really just getting at, 6 in 10 people have never used mobility on demand or have maybe only used one mode that might be a part of a mobility on demand program once. And that there are some folks in our survey who indicated no interest in using them, especially among non-users. And regardless of whether you have experience and you're really satisfied with your experience with the use of mobility on demand, or you've never used it, you don't have that experience and you're not interested in using mobility on demand at some point in the future, the reality is regardless of what camp you're in, you have to coexist with these programs. You have to arguably live in a community that may have bikes and scooters for rent available to the public. You may have to walk past scooters parked strangely on the sidewalk that you're trying as you try to pass by. And it's, I think, on us as stakeholders on this issue to work to address through public policy and the way that in terms of how these programs are managed so that all boats rise, that whether you're a user or non-user, that the community overall is better off. And that these modes and services aren't a challenge for people who don't use them, but that they are helping people who do. And then the last note here is really speaking to, at least according to the data in this survey, that older adults are the least likely to have had any experience in using mobility on demand, and also the least likely to report any interest in doing so in the future. And the irony here is that older adults today represent the fastest growing population in the United States. And older adults, as a rule, are going to outlive their ability to drive themselves in their own vehicles by an average of 7 to 10 years, depending on their gender. And so life has to continue after you give up driving your own vehicle. And mobility on demand stands to benefit this particular group of people arguably the most. And so I think that there's a real opportunity here to, in particular, address any potential safety concerns that this group of potential users might have, in hopes that they'll benefit from them to extend their safe mobility as they continue to age in place. So I will stop there, Amy, and I'll stop sharing my screen as well, so that maybe we can see more folks who are tuned in today as we go through Q&A.
Perfect. Thanks, Jake. And, we've had a few questions come in as we were talking about this. And let me ask you sort of a couple of them as we go. And then I want to turn it into Andy for some thoughts and comments. But one of the notes was whether or not this survey had looked at infrastructure. So things like mobility hubs, where you co-locate some of these services and that kind of thing, as making a difference in, how these trips are replaced and that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So I would say no. Short answer, no. We didn't ask about mobility hubs. I would say the closest we got to that was in terms of how you can pay for, these modes. So we talked, and especially in the scenarios that we presented, about kiosks in the community where you could access and pay for the modes that you had planned to use that day. Presumably, these kiosks would be in drop-off and pickup locations. So arguably a hub, maybe, but probably not in the way that that question came in.
Yeah, and I think that will be the interesting piece of this. And as we continue to evolve this survey, and this is one of the reasons why we were wanting Andy to also speak, is the insight that this survey gives us as practitioners in this space as well, and how we pull this information out and how we look at it and the kind of work we do. And I was looking at some of our participants, and I may call it a few of you, Elliot, Woeway, and others, in this concept of, if we build it, will people come? And sort of what the interplay between all of this is. And, Andy, obviously you guys have had a series of different experiences as you look across the nation and as you really look across internationally about mobility on demand, the intersection with the customers, the intersection with practitioners, and how we are trying to plan and engage this transportation system. And frankly, how also the private sector is involving itself. Much of all of what we just talked about here was entirely brought about by private sector mobility providers who saw a need and have started to build into this system. And in collaboration with publics, at odds in sometimes with the public sector, and now as we move into sort of a more robust, mature system, it's starting to evolve. But I was hoping for your sort of thoughts and observations on the survey, and as you see the landscape nationally continuing to evolve.
I think my first thought is, after Jake mentioned about looking at your sort of grandmothers on scooters, I can't get the image of my 75-year-old mother on an electric scooter with a little dog, and that's sort of panicking me slightly at the moment. So I think that's one of the first areas we're going to have to address. There are some fantastic data elements in there, and I've made a list as we've gone through, and I've read the report and everything, and there's a lot to unpack. I think the key thing that comes out is, one of those metrics about safety. 50% of the users feel sort of unsafe using micromobility solutions on the same road as on the same road as like road vehicles. Very much the case. That's a global problem. And that's what a lot of cities in Europe are looking to address that issue now. So places like Paris, where have shut down whole boulevards and avenues to turn them into pedestrianised areas to use scooters. London having dedicated cycle lanes through the heart of the city. Amsterdam getting rid of 100,000 parking spaces on the road to create more cycle lanes in Amsterdam. It's a case of it's the cycling capital anyway, but now they want to promote it even more. They want to make it even easier. Issues around licensing and vetting of taxi, that's obviously very germane as well. It's a case of how do we provide that level of trust? And it does come down to trust and partnership. And it has to be a partnership between the public and the private agencies at the end of the day. There was the issue about liability. I think the whole discussion around insurance of mobility trips now is sort of very pertinent. There's been several webinars in sort of Europe. We've seen a lot of financial organizations getting more and more interested in the insurance aspects of these sort of combined journeys. Emissions and climate. I'm going to be honest. It doesn't surprise me that people think that it's not not one of the key factors here. I think it will change over time. The new administration, some of the efforts that they're putting into sort of promotion of the sort of environmental sustainability within sort of infrastructure improvements, I think that message will resonate slowly through this sort of arena. So it'd be great to see in a few years' time how that's evolved, how that's sort of moved forward. Saying that sort of mobility on demand on its own is not going to be the key disruptor we think it will be. And I wholeheartedly agree. I've often said that mass and mobility on demand, it's a slow burner. It's a road. It's a journey that we're all going to go on. And that journey is going to veer off in different directions everywhere we go. So I think one of the key things is no one city or no one region is going to go full mobility on demand on Monday morning. This has to be an evolution. It's got to be a slow process. And if we want to see the reduction in congestion on the roads, it's probably part of a jigsaw that will get us to that full picture. So if you start looking at vehicle miles traveled, congestion zone charging, whatever it's going to be, I think a combination of having better mobility on demand and providing better mobility options combined with incentivization not to use personal vehicles could actually be the trigger to see a rapid increase in the use of mobility on demand. I think coming down to one of the other points you made at the end was, the user groups which are likely to benefit the most are likely to, are the ones who are not using it at the moment. I think it's down to an education piece. And I hate to bring my mum back into it again, but she often asks me, what do you do? And I try and tell her and I explain mobility as a service to her. And sometimes I get the feeling it goes straight over her head. And it's a case of we've really got to drum home the benefits of what this means. Everybody has been sort of so ingrained, and if they want to get somewhere, it's a case of just jump in the car and go. But nobody understands what the true cost of that individual journey is and how it mounts up over time. If I want to get on if I want to do a multimodal journey from where I am in Alexandria into the solar center of Washington, D.C., I understand what it's going to cost me in terms of my effort to walk to the metro station, what it costs on the metro, and then all the associated sort of maybe bike hire at the other end when I get to D.C. When I'm driving a car, I don't understand what my lease car costs, what the maintenance costs, what the gas costs, what the parking costs, what the environmental emissions cost. There's no sort of summation in that. So it's hard to compare apple to apples. So it's how do you educate people on the true cost of mobility? And Amy, just to get back to the last point, and then I'll shut up and then we can get into more questions. You mentioned about sort of, it's been private mobility service providers and private mass operators that really led the discussion for like the last 5 years. And that's very true. But you've got to look at the DNA of those organizations. They are very highly funded by venture capitalists normally, or sort of, organizations that really want to invest in mobility. They have a desire to sort of go out and capture and shape a market. They're prepared to take high risks to get sort of that foothold in the door. And then you're having to combine that with public transportation and public agencies, which have limited budgets, a low risk threshold. So are very reticent to sort of move down that path of embracing private mobility for fear that it's a case of, it's going to blow back in their face. One thing I know about transit agencies is the last thing that they want to do is appear on the front page of a newspaper for wasting public funds. It's a case of, they have to be very cost conscious and they have to deliver for 100% of the population in a region, not just as Jake mentions, the ones with smartphones and credit cards. So it's a case of how can you deliver mobility on demand, but how do you make it accessible for a large amount of the population? Now, that's been the last 5 years. And I think 2020, as it was an eventful year, but it's really sort of brought into sharp focus what mobility to a city means. Now, public transit agencies have had their services decimated. It's been absolutely tragic what we've seen to public transportation and the impact that the pandemic has had. But luckily, the funding is in place now. Now they're looking to build back better. It's a case of how can we build resilient networks, but how can we build better networks? And this is what I'm seeing now, not just in North America, but all around the world. It's public agencies looking to private mobility saying, okay, how can we sort of work together to provide an augmented public transportation network? How can we bring in these different mobility options to bring people to public transportation to get them to where they want to be? How can we build a resilient network that's a flexible network, there's an accessible network, a network that delivers mobility solutions for the users at the end of the day. And now I'm seeing this with the cities and regions sort of taking ownership of this. It's a case of this pivot. It's almost like the second generation of mobility on demand at the moment. It's a case of how are we going to evolve into that sort of discussion space. And as long as the cities are sort of in control, I think this is the time when mobility demand can grow and it can really get a foothold. Simply because as a private mobility service provider or mass operator or a mod operator going into a region, you're trying to capture a market, you're trying to get a foothold, you're trying to get some income through the door. Now, by embracing and working with the city in a trusted partnership, this is when we start to see some of these barriers break down. You might not be getting the income lines that you expected straight away because the city may want to control and regulate how you operate to make sure that you're delivering the best for everybody in the region. But as Jake again mentioned, the rising tide. If everybody starts to use these services, public transport benefits, private mobility will see a profit coming in, people will get educated, and through word of mouth, people are going to start to use these functions more and more. And it's what we've seen in different areas of the world. There's been some fantastic demand responsive transport pilot programs which have gone on in Australia, and they've been running for a period of sort of 2 years now. And for the first 12 months, it was hard work to justify why we were subsidizing these routes so much to actually get people to use them. But now through word of mouth, communities exchanging information, better education and advertising from the agencies, we're seeing people embrace them now to a point where it's becoming almost like cost neutral for them to actually operate. So it's a case of it is a long tail. You've got to give it time to bed in and work. You can't expect a pilot program to work overnight. So I think we are seeing this shift. I think from my side, this survey has been a real eye-opener. It's provided that level of detail that I've really enjoyed sort of delving into. I would love to see this done in different parts of the world. I'd love to see this done with sort of, Western Europe or sort of an Asia Pacific region. I'd like to see if that 13% of car users would give up their car is different in other regions. I bet it's going to be. But it's a case of let's keep plugging away at this one. This is a valuable resource of information. I'm really pleased that it's been done.
And in fact, we've been talking with our colleagues at the Moss Alliance to see if there's a way that we could think about how we pull this survey into more of an international scope so we could do that comparative globally. And, folks, I'm going to turn to you and I'm going to ask you a question in the chat. We're excited, also, Andy, as we are thinking about how we pull some of this globally and talking with our partners with the Moss Alliance in that space, as I mentioned before, and to really get to that global answer of this. And I think you hit on some questions, actually, they're starting to get asked in the chat. But to my public and to my attendees, so now go into your chat because I'm going to be asking you all a question. And, we go back to the title of this event. Is MOD a thing? Is it real enough? Is it become vested enough now in this ecosystem that we have? And based on what you saw in the survey results, and if we build it, will people come? And how do we cross the gap with the public? And so, Rachel, if I could ask you to do this, and Elliot, you asked a question, and I'm going to summarize it quickly. But if you are, we'd like to take you off mute, and I'd love for you to sort of ask this question from your perspective because I think that this is an interesting piece. You're talking about how early we are in the innovation cycle of MOD. And again, this customer base looks like they're sort of early adopters. And Elliot, if you could, and if you're listening, I'd love for you to ask your question live because I think there's some insight, and especially what you guys are thinking about doing in Minnesota, because we asked your scenario in Minnesota, if we build these mobility platforms, this Moss platform to pull it all together, are people interested in that? They want to use it. But Elliot, are you there?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
We can. Great.
Okay. Yeah. My question, having been involved in this space for quite a while, it seems like we're always, at least so far, still very early in adoption, very early in the innovation cycle. And thinking about, and the survey would certainly indicate we're still very much in the early adopter stage, and the early majority of the mass market is maybe dipped their toe in mod, but not really embraced it as a technology they want to use every day. And so I wanted to get thoughts on, what should we be thinking about to cross that chasm, to get from those early adopters to that majority market, and what role public policy plays? Because if we're not solving a problem, if we're not making people's lives better than the alternative they have right now, it's going to be very difficult for us to get beyond those early visionaries who love the idea of mod to everyday people. So wanted to hear thoughts on, how we cross that chasm, how we maybe use the public sector as a partner to help make these services more attractive.
Thanks, Elliot. And we'll maybe come back to you and ask you sort of how you think you're doing it also with some of what you're going to deliver. But Jake, maybe let me turn that over to you just to start it, because AAA had this interesting perspective because you have your finger on the pulse of your customers and your members. And this is in part why we wanted to do the survey together, was because of that piece of it. And you've talked with clubs and you've talked with others as they're looking at this. And how do you see this, bridging the gap based on what you saw in the survey and the like?
Well, I don't want to get too academic, but some of you may have heard of the law of diffusion of innovation. And that's what Elliot just talked about, early adopters, and that's part of that concept. And I feel like word of mouth is especially coming from those early adopters to people they know, their friends, their family, their coworkers. That's what's gonna sort of push us over the hump, right? And if there's anything that's very clear from the results of the survey that we did, it's that if you can just bring yourself to use it and expose yourself to one or more of the mobility on demand options that might exist where you live or where you travel for that matter, that you're going to be, generally speaking, really satisfied with your experience. And that's a good thing. And so it's a matter of getting people over that initial hump of use. And so, I see taking advantage of people who are satisfied, happy users of mobility on demand in communities where they exist, and leveraging them to help with word of mouth. And you have to give them tools to do that, right? Andy talked about the reality that we don't understand the true cost to drive our personally owned automobile because we're not seeing that incremental cost come out of our pocketbook. And the same way that we would as we, pay for transit use or to rent a bike or a scooter or something like that. So you're seeing that cost every time. Somebody needs to develop an app that not only allows people to access these services the way that you all are very familiar, but if that app also tracked your use of your own automobile to make trips and was able to sort of show the split between costs of using your own personal automobile and using mobility on demand services over time. And obviously that could titrate over time, right? Like 1 month you may have used your car more, 1 month you may have used mobility on demand more often. But if it's monetizing that in terms of dollars and cents for you, and a user can see that over time from 1 month to the next, that really makes the challenge of trying to educate people with the goal of changing their behavior that much easier, because those costs are going to really motivate people a lot. And if they're producing those data on their own, that will influence their behavior in ways that we can't through education. So I feel like those are things that are probably going to be really impactful.
It's an interesting piece. And Andy, obviously that's been some of the discussion for transit for a long time, is that same kind of thing. Hey, look, if I were on transit, I'd save $10,000 a year in my travel and I could put that to X, et cetera. And that is compelling for some and not as on either, and sort of that balance between cost to convenience and the like. And I think that's some of what the on-demand mobility piece is. A lot of people critique or complain about, the ubiquity, if you will, of a scooter being in a community. But I think we all recognize that seeing it right there at your fingertips and being able to just go and grab it puts the convenience factor in a way that others may not. And that's the point of on demand with all of this. And I'm curious your thoughts to Elliot's questions about sort of this gap and expanding on that. And then we have some more coming in on the chat that I want to talk about a little bit about related to social justice and like. But Andy.
So it does come down to perceptions of how you actually use things as well. And how you've actually paid for it. It's a case of, I've spoken to my neighbors about it. They've all got cars parked outside, and it's a case, well, I paid for it, might as well use it. So it's like, well, you're still paying for it on a regular basis, but when it comes to renewing, you're going to keep doing that. What's the options beyond that? So it's about sort of how you educate over that way. And it's long-term sort of ingrained reactions to the way that people do stuff. I mean, there's a famous meme that's been on the internet for some time. You know, in the 1980s, you were told not to talk to strangers in cars. 1990s, you're told not to talk to people on the internet. But as soon as you get to 2010 and beyond, you're now ordering a stranger in a car on the internet to come and pick you up and take you away. It's that ingrained perception of I've always done it this way. I'm going to continue to do it in this way. So how do you break that cycle? And I think the best way to break the cycle is you need public bodies to basically educate and incentivize. So how can I get people off the road and onto public transportation? How can I, once I get them using it about sort of 5, 6, and I think the magic number is 7. If you can get them to use it 7 times, then it sticks. So it's a case of how can you incentivize people to do that? And there's different places are using this around the world. There was trying to think of the city in Eastern Europe where there's a toll bridge that goes across one of the major rivers into the city, and to incentive, and it's obviously a big congestion hotspot. So they would actually hand out free passes to people when they got their ticket to cross the river. They would hand out a free pass to actually use the train to get in, and it drastically reduced congestion because people thought, well, I'll give it a go because I'm sick of sitting in traffic. So it was an incentive. But then you've got to just go down to the base level education. It's a case of these are the options available to you. This is what you can do. You know, trying to make it a compelling story as to why you want to do this. I think I saw one of the questions mentioned mobility hubs. If you look at what's been going on in Hamburg with their sort of mobility hubs that they've set up sort of around the circumference of the city where you can actually park, you can drive to, you can park, you can charge your vehicle, you can pick up a bike, an electric bike, you can pick up the subway or a buses, you can pick up an Uber, a Lyft or a regular taxi. There's the Amazon lockers where you can pick your packages up as well at the end of the day. There's like small supermarkets. Austin, Texas, what they've done with putting medical facilities in these hubs as well. It's a case of it's like a central point where you can actually do that interchange. It provides value. And that tends to draw a lot of interest and education, and people want to use it and invest, and it becomes part of the daily process then. But you've really got to sort of put emphasis into education and sort of investment in those mobility hubs. And for Germany, the country of the king, the inventors of the automobile, for them to want you to stop driving your cars into the center of a city and adopt this new form of mobility, I think they might be onto something. I think that's something we should definitely look at. Yeah.
And, I think that is piece, and who knows, as we go into the next level of surveys, I think that, it would be interesting. So we've talked about the digital interactions with the services themselves, plus the ability to book and pay and the seamlessness of that experience and whether that interests you in the future. And how we weave in the infrastructure elements and sort of the ease of it. Brent Kane, you made a comment here about you can't push masses, but you can provide benefits on the Y shift. And I'm curious if you wanted to add to that really quickly. And then I wanted to have, so that's Brent Kane, and we'll take you off mute if you just wanted to add in that comment. And I'm going to make a couple comments on some of the conversations that we're getting from folks. But Brent, did you want to add in on this?
No, I think it's a good point, and the speakers were very well versed and stated in basically how do we get that rationale to folks to do that mode shift. I think again providing that opportunity, and it is growing, but it just needs to continue to grow. Mm-hmm. People in the U.S. have a long love affair with the transportation freedom that they have to get on the freeway system and what not to use. So, but again, to really share and show, like what I think Andy noted, to really explain the why, I think goes a long way.
Yeah, no, I agree. And one of our other folks here commented in the chat about 2 studies recently that came out that talk about the perceptions of time and people underestimating how long it takes actually to get somewhere in a car, but overestimating how long it takes to walk somewhere, for instance, unless the surrounding is really pleasant, actually. So if it's a long slog, or the perception of a long slog, or it has a lot of traffic stress or transit stress, the perceptions of those trips are different. I think as we go into this, one of the questions that was also asked about whether or not the survey addressed the attitudes of travelers of MOD related to fixed route transit. And Jake, maybe you wanted to talk a little bit about that. And then I wanted to come back again to some of these conversations about social justice, because this is a question that we're also getting, but how we looked at travelers and fixed route transit and what that meant in relation to MOD.
So I correct me if I'm not understanding your question correctly, but we didn't ask in the survey respondents about the programs necessarily. Well, we asked them about the programs available to them, where they live, traveled, whatever. So fixed route travel, you're referring to
like fixed route bus lines. And and I think that if I'm going to look at the question, and as we asked it, they were curious, perhaps did you ask an either or question? Did you prefer one to the other? And I think what the most that the survey got into was looking at what didn't you do if you chose to take an MOD service.
Yeah.
And Michael, if you want to raise your hand, we could ask you to ask that question live too, so we make sure that we understand that question. But maybe you can talk a little bit about that, Michael, as you're raising your hand, then we could unmute you.
Yeah, so we got at that a little bit, but I'm just going back to the slide on that just to be clear here. So it was kind of general.
Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah, we can. That's perfect. Yeah. I wanted to go into that.
Getting some feedback though.
But I can't hear you guys. You can hear me. So
we can hear you, Michael, if you can hear us.
If you can't hear me, I was trying to get at the benefit of combining MOD options with fixed route transit, that it's often a complementary service and helps many travelers would like to take a combined transit MOD trip for their journey.
Great. Yeah, that combination, Michael, we did hear you. So thank you on that. And it didn't quite hit sort of at the systems integration levels at this point yet, but I think there is value in how we look at those elements. And back to the comments I think that Andy was making about sort of the 2.0 of mobility on demand, and how we think now about the systems integration elements of what this is, rather than discrete services, for instance, as being one or the other. And Jake, I don't know if you wanted to add into that.
Yeah. So, we asked about ride hailing, on-call shuttles, car sharing like Zipcar, rented scooters, rented bikes. So these are the modes that we asked about. If they were not available, how else would you have completed that trip? And taken public transit was one answer choice. We didn't ask the reverse, right? That if you took it by public transit and that wasn't available, how would you have taken it? So we really only got in this survey one side of that issue. I think to really understand that properly, we want to ask the reverse as well. So we should be asking about all the modes that would be in a true mobility on demand program or service within a community, including fixed route public transit. And if that was the route somebody took for a trip and that mode wasn't available, how else would they have completed that trip? We're not getting the reverse of it in this survey. So we should think about that in a year or two when we go for round two to understand this, more comprehensively.
I appreciate that. And, I think as we go into round two, and as we also think about the users, one of the questions that we got was about the perspective of social justice, sorry about that, reflected in the experience of mobility on demand. And obviously this is a critical topic, in regards to the equity of use and the users. And let me do this, Jake. I think one of the most interesting elements of the survey that came out for me was who is using it, and the predominant users actually, or more so, being people of color. We also saw higher use in people who are low income. Interestingly enough, and if you pair that, we're going to go into perhaps a more detailed analysis on the back end related to the type of use. For instance, that would be counterintuitive in the sense of a lower income community or a member using ride sourcing services and ride sharing, which are a more expensive, for instance, option perhaps than another alternative. And so as we think about this from a social justice perspective, I'd love your thoughts, Andy and Jake. And then Mohammed, I might ask you to sort of pop in and just share a little bit more of what you were thinking with that question as well. So it's Mohammed Zali, I believe. So Jay, Rachel, we can unlock him. But Jake and Andy.
Yeah, so I'll go first. We didn't, as you know, Amy, we didn't really try to tease out issues of racial equity and or even other forms of equity separate from race entirely, like people who identify as living with a disability. It's another group of people that could stand to benefit a lot from these kinds of programs and services. So, that might be something we consider in our next survey, is to tease out those issues better and understand how, those groups feel about mobility on demand and their use of them. In our survey, we did obviously do some modeling, looking at demographic variables to see, which demographics allowed us to predict whether or not somebody used, and people of color were one of the groups that came out. People of color are more likely than whites to take advantage of one or more mobility on demand modes. And we don't know why that is according using our survey data, but we can make some educated guesses about that, right? So where do most mobility on demand operations exist? Urban centers. So, people of color in urban centers who don't own their own vehicle, which was another question we asked, vehicle ownership. People of color less likely to own their own automobile. Therefore, they have to rely on these kinds of programs and services. But I think that there are a lot of issues related to equity in transportation, mobility on demand included, that we didn't at all get at in this survey. And, we touched on them a little bit in our scenario. So like being able to pay with a mass transit card, so you don't have to have a smartphone, or accessing mobility on demand through a community kiosk would be another way, so long as that kiosk was available in a community where people of color could access it, as one example. So I think there's a lot of work to do on this front. It's super interesting to me for sure, as it relates to mobility on demand, but just transportation more generally too. Andy, I'll hand it off to you.
And actually, Andy, before you do that, Mohammed sort of popped in. And so Mohammed, did you want to add any more comment as Andy sort of wraps this up and as we come to the close of our event here? But Mohammed?
Thank you for giving me a chance. So actually, I was more concerned about the social equity in terms when we are talking about different group of users. I think in American context, it is more about the differentiation between the people of color and the others. But let's say outside US, when we are talking about, so as I'm also working on MOD in European context, so in here, when we are talking about the urban MOD, so we are more focused towards how the distribution of the subsidy is, like how the subsidy is divided between different classes. So who are the actually user of those subsidized services? Let's say we had a pilot project in Helsinki. So we were talking about if these services are subsidized, so who is actually using the services, and what is the response we are getting from from it. So
yeah. Thank you, Mohammed. Andy, I'll let you wrap that up and sort of weave in also sort of this relationship of social justice, subsidizing transit, incentivizing transit, and then even the profit models that we have. And, one of our panelists asked, one of the questions came in is like, will this lack of profit really impact adoption to MOD as we go in the future? But you can see I'm trying to combine a lot as we finish our last comments there, but then we'll wrap it up as we go.
Short answer for you, we don't know everything yet. We're still learning as we're evolving. That's the main thing here. It's a case of mobility on demand is growing. It's becoming more of a topic here in the US. I think the US is maybe about sort of 12 to 18 months behind the rest of the world in this sort of discussion. But there are a number of issues that we've still got to address, which is all going to keep us busy for the foreseeable future. Technology integration, the business models, the operational models, the policy, the politics, the trust engagement models, the equity models. We need to increase our discussion with the community. We need to make sure that everybody's voices are being heard in this. And I think this survey is the first step in trying to get a better understanding about the evolving landscape in which we're all working.
Thank you, Andy. That's actually a wonderful close. And for those of you who are curious about the survey itself and the report tools and the like, we will be finalizing that report, and that will be available to all of our ITS America members, our Mobility on Demand Alliance members. So we'll be sending that out. Executive summary is also on our website, so that is available there. And I think that, again, that the baseline of this, those of you who are curious, do you have a baseline pre-COVID, et cetera? The intent for us right now is to start setting this baseline so that we can engage and take this information, be able to use it to build this broader ecosystem. So we really can look at how on-demand mobility helps deliver mobility for all. So thank you so much for your time, and we greatly appreciate the discussion with all, and thanks for tuning into our webinar.